Hey, what's up, guys? It's Justin Kahn, and you are listening to my podcast, The Quest. Today, my conversation is with my brother, Dan, co-founder of Cruise, the self-driving car company. So I'm really excited to have this conversation because Dan and I get to talk about what it was like growing up. We also cover some of our lessons from early startups, including our company exec, what it was like for him to found Cruise, being the non-technical co-founder in a self-driving car startup, what he's learned and how he's grown, especially around being an emotionally intelligent leader, and a lot more. As adults, one of the best things in my life has been to have adult brothers that I've been close to and been able to work with. And I think we had a really fun conversation. So without further ado, here's my brother, Dan. I'm very excited to have you on the podcast. This was a request, actually. People had requested. They were like, get your family on here. And so I'm excited to talk to you. Let's get started with the family. You know, what was our family like growing up?
Oh, man. I mean, I'm sure you have different memories of how that all played out. But I would say we were not the typical tiger mom Asian family, but there
were tiger elements.
There were tiger elements, and I'd say maybe this isn't a tiger element, but definitely a little more passive aggressive judging went on, but not strictly like, no, I'm gonna like burn your magic cards if you don't get an A. It's more of like, oh, you didn't get an A. Why not? What happened?
Yeah. So what was our family dynamic like? You know, I guess my perspective, I hope our parents are listening to this, but I'll just tell it straight up as it is anyways. Mom kind of wears the pants in the relationship. She was like in charge, where everybody was like on mom's train. She wanted to do certain things. She wanted to put us in private school, for example. And then our dad always just kind of went along with what she wanted to do and helped facilitate that. He was more passive and kind of quiet. And we were all kind of living in mom's world in a way. Did you feel that way?
I guess so, to a certain extent. I mean, I think dad is a lot like me, where things happen and you want to do your best and keep people happy and kind of went along with it for a lot of things.
Yeah. I guess I'm more like our mom, where our mom had all these crazy ideas. I remember she took me to this day trading seminar one time. That was like by one of those guys who like sold day trading seminars instead of actually making money on the stock market. And she would always have these like new business ideas or interests, right? She was at various times a computer scientist, programmer, and then she was a mortgage broker and real estate agent. And then she was now a marriage and family therapist. And she would just always be into new stuff and then evangelizing that new stuff, which is basically what I've become. And then she was into all the spirituality stuff like yoga and meditation, and she's very religious. And, now I look at myself and I've just become our mom.
On the other side, I think dad stayed at 2 jobs or 3 jobs his entire career doing finance. And in a lot of ways was content with that. And, I think I'm somewhat more closely related to that.
Yeah. He had a lot more baseline contentedness, I guess, right? More acceptance and being okay with the current state of affairs.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I mean, that's good in a lot of ways, right? I think it's very healthy in many ways.
I do. I think, part of it probably has to do with how they were raised, right? And where they were raised. Dad was born in the US, was basically told from an early age to be like everybody else, essentially fit in with white people. Whereas mom was born in communist China and then was raised throughout parts of Asia, kind of working her way to the US when she was 18 to go on to get a degree or multiple degrees. And then I think at one point she worked on like rockets in Nevada.
Yep.
Yeah. So very different upbringings, I'd say.
Yeah. So what about our upbringing? So it was, when people come and they say, oh my God, you and your brothers are so successful in tech and entrepreneurial. You founded all these companies. Dan founded Cruise. And what was the secret sauce? What did your mom do or your dad do? What was the, secret parenting? Do you think there was something entrepreneurial in how we were raised?
I think, obviously seeing our mom go through starting her own businesses definitely doesn't hurt, right? You see it as an example for us. When she started her mortgage business, she actually had us help with various things around there. She would buy kind of distressed houses, I guess is what I would call them now.
Yeah.
And we'd kind of flip them to rent them. I would be like doing siding on houses or like painting houses, which I'm definitely not qualified to do as a 15-year-old, but people lived in those houses and they seem to work. And so I do think there's probably some aspect of we were around someone who just said, okay, you got to get it done. Here's the task, figure out how to get it done. And that's a lot of entrepreneurship.
It's interesting. I have so many both positive things that came from those early experiences, especially working at her mortgage brokerage and real estate agency company, and so many negative ones. I remember I would have to fax paperwork to these random, mortgage companies or whatever, banks or.
That was a pain.
It was horrible. The fax machine we had was terrible, but also I'd have to get on the phone and call them. I'd have to call them and see if they got it. And I remember I hated that part because I was so introverted, or I was shy. Actually, I was kind of a shy extrovert that I didn't want to talk to anybody. And I hated calling people on the phone. So mom would make me do it. And so I'd call these people and I hated it. And it gave me this complex about phones. I hate getting on the phone with people I don't know. I love getting on the phone with people I know, but I hate calling a restaurant to get reservations or a hotel or whatever. And I have this complex from when I was a kid,
Yeah. I mean, I think you and everyone else now, but yes, yeah, definitely.
But I also have this aversion to paperwork. We would have to enter in, all this data entry into these like mortgage applications that were terrible software. I had such an aversion as an adult. I hired someone so I wouldn't even have to talk to the vendors who were like doing that stuff for me.
Yeah.
And only more recently in the last couple of years have I realized how some of those formative experiences from when we were kids, created these triggers and reactivity when I was an adult.
Yeah, well, I think that's one thing mom did really well, and mom and dad really was like, go do these kind of shitty jobs, to be honest, to first understand what it's like and to appreciate them, but also to like know what you don't want to do, right? Like my first job was as a bank teller that almost like, hey, you got to like go start working when I was 15. I think 15 and a half maybe. And that taught me that I never want to work directly in customer service ever again.
You had that job for a long time, didn't you? A couple of years.
Yeah, through high school, all the way to the end of high school. So it's probably 2.5 years or so.
Yeah, I had one of those jobs. I remember it wasn't for very long, but I was a stockroom attendant too at University of Washington Medical Center.
Ah, okay.
And I had to wake up at 5 a.m. every morning to take the bus there to get there at 6 to work. For this shift was from 6 to 1:30. And so lunch was like at 9:30 or 10 or something like that.
Breakfast.
And yeah, it was a horrible job. It wasn't, to be fair, actually, it wasn't that bad of a job, but it was just so boring. I mean, it was every day you go and get something from, just like getting orders and filling orders in this stock room and then bringing them up to the random clinics. But it was also the repository for all the kind of worst people, I think, in the building. They were really trying to fill certain quotas there. And there was definitely people. I remember one guy he was kind of like a little bit crazy. He would tell all these stories about how he was in the military and only military people could have this type of endangered fish. So he had this, endangered fish that he was raising to repopulate the population, but you could only have one if you were in the military. And he told this story about how a jet engine fell on his friend in the aircraft carrier or something, and he lifted it off himself. And I remember when people would order stuff in the stockroom, if he got the job, he would literally sprint through the hallways around people with wheelchairs and like doctors with these random a catheter or whatever, like to get it to the clinic as fast as possible, which is it was not safe. It was not productive. But
was he measured on?
No, there was no measurement. And most of the people in the stockroom actually we would get an order and they were like super lazy. They would just put it in the queue and then go back to reading a book or whatever. Finishing up after my, 4 months there or whatever, I was working in the summer before going to college. The manager was like, if you ever want to come back, you could come back in, please come back, basically. Because I just like did the jobs as they came in. And that was already like way good for the stockroom.
Well, exceeding expectations.
Yes.
But you didn't go back, right? Because it taught you that you didn't want to do that.
Yes, for sure. Life. It was a good lesson. It's a good lesson. So I guess that what you're saying is the inspiration that drove us towards entrepreneurship was just seeing mom struggle at her small businesses.
Well, I think that's part of it. I think the other thing is how we were raised. I always go back to this because I think of this a lot. That's part of my role now. I'm always trying to improve efficiency. And I remember, you've talked about how we had to split up chores and how we divide and conquer and whatnot. But I remember learning to wipe the table in square patterns from one end to the other, because that was the most efficient way so that you got every inch of the table and didn't have to go back and wipe it again, right? Like circles doesn't make sense if you're actually trying to wipe from one end to the other. And, that's just like efficiency, trying to be more efficient with our time, our energy, I think has also driven us to, or at least me, to think about how to improve in the world.
Yeah, our mom was super OCD about that stuff. She was, if you were vacuuming and you didn't go in straight lines back and forth, that was not good enough.
I remember one time, and I distinctly remember this because we were actually on our way to lunch. We were going to go and get some Chinese food on Aurora. And we stopped to get gas, and I cleaned the back window, right? I took the little squeegee thing and I cleaned the back window, and then gas stopped and I got back in the car, and I was driving at the time, and my mom was like, why didn't you clean the front window? You look through the front window all the time. The back window, if you only have time for one thing, you should probably clean the front window. And I remember getting into a huge fight, so much so that we like turned around and went home. It was in retrospect, in hindsight, she's like 100% right. Of course, you're looking through the front window all the time. Why not? But at the time I was just so like, why do you even care about this? But that stuck with me, right? It's been something where now I look at it as, how can I be the most efficient and get the most out of the least amount of work possible, essentially.
So it's interesting because that's both, it serves you in a way, right? In that it's maybe made you more productive, but it also, there was a cost to that, which was obviously it ruined your lunch with mom, or that situation did. And then I would say that our mom did make sacrifices in her relationships with her children in order to instill certain values. That part is maybe a little bit more typical Tiger mom. And I think about that a lot with regards to, now that I have a kid, and how do I want to raise my kid? And I think for mom, it was almost a compulsion to say, it has to be this way. Maybe it's not. Maybe you want to impart that lesson, and she wants to tell you about that, the efficiency of wiping the front window versus the back window. But maybe it's not worth ruining lunch with your son over. I think that when it's compulsive, you could be swept along into these situations when your need for something in the world to be a certain way, I need it to be efficient, is compulsive. You can be swept along into a situation maybe you wouldn't choose if it wasn't compulsive. I think about that a lot with my son because I don't know that I want to have the same relationship.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely a choice that we make, whether or not you want to go out and kind of tell people, oh, you got to do it this way, and there could be repercussions, or figure out another time or place to import that back onto people.
Yeah. So let's talk about your first startup. I want to hear about how you got into startups. Well, I know, but I want to tell the audience about how you got into startups, and then how we started a startup together, and what a giant pain in the ass that was.
Yeah. So I actually never thought I would get into startups when I was going through college and kind of starting my career. I remember graduating in 2009 at the height of the recession, and basically not being able to get a job. And you probably remember this too, because you tried to help me get various jobs all over the place. But basically, All the finance consulting jobs dried up. There were no jobs there. And after applying to 30 plus jobs as a senior, I got two. One of them was to join a startup called User Voice in San Francisco. The other was to go teach English in Korea. And I chose going to San Francisco because I didn't want to repeat the same job process a year later if I went to teach English in Korea. And so I went to go work for a friend of ours now, Rich, who started this company. And the day I started, my boss, or the person who was supposed to be my boss, was let go. And so I basically assumed his role as best as I could, right? As like my offer letter said head fire starter was my title or something, which, at the time I was like, I don't know what that means.
It's one of those bullshit startup titles.
Yeah. But what it really meant was I was in charge of basically everything except for the product, like sales, office stuff, company culture, meeting things, I don't know, or just random things, but primarily like the sales of the company. And I didn't know anything about sales. And so they hired a consultant to like teach me, like to help kind of teach me the high level stuff. And I did that for maybe 2 years, almost 2 years. And then decided that, if I was going to work in this industry, I might as well just like try doing it myself. So, seeing you and others around me start companies, I was like, it doesn't seem that hard. Turns out I was completely wrong. And I recruited a friend of mine from high school and our friend Amir to start a company called Appetizely. Yeah, it's a horrible name. It's very hard to spell, which basically would build apps for restaurants. And the premise was Groupon was killing restaurants. And if you, as a restaurant, could have your own app that could send deals to people when you were slow, your regulars, you could attract people in and draw in business. And so we built this entire interface, and that would allow restaurant owners to send messages to people who downloaded their apps. And about, I don't know, maybe 2 months into building it, Apple called us and basically said, hey, all your apps need to be aggregated into one app. They all have the same functionality. Or you need to buy separate Apple accounts for each of these apps, which kind of made our product untenable because most restaurants don't have a whole lot of margin to like spend on developer accounts. And at the time weren't really convinced, or probably still aren't convinced, that they need their own app. So we decided to pivot, and that's when you joined us, or you suggested the idea, hey, let's start Exec, which was on-demand personal assistance, and then eventually house cleaning services that we worked on for the next 2 years.
Yeah, so it was very much a terrible. I mean, there was some insights in there that people didn't want to do things themselves, and that was kind of my core insight. I remember thinking of the idea for Exec on the way to Burning Man. One of my friends had a ticket that he needed to get from point A to point B so our other friend could drive it up for him. And I suggested he call an Uber and tell him, go to point A, don't pick me up, just go to my apartment, which is where my ticket was, pick it up, and then drive it to my office. And that actually worked. And so that light bulb went off, and I was like, someone should start a kind of on-demand personal assistant app. And there was TaskRabbit, which was not on demand. You had to book a job. But I thought we should start a personal assistant app. TaskRabbit raised a bunch of money. All these other online to offline kind of Uber for X's were raising money. So I was like, this could be a thing. And we decided to go for it. And we raised a pretty big round, $3.7 million, which was a big seed round at the time. And we were building this thing. And then, the problem was people just did not know how to use on-demand personal assistant.
I think there were a number of problems. I think one of them was, looking back on it, this was the most San Francisco 1% startup, I think, out there. You can hire someone to go and pick up your laundry or get your groceries, and all of these things are now, their own verticals, but really do anything. To your point, people didn't know how to use it. You'd give them credits and they'd say, look, I don't really, like, what do you mean? And then you'd give them suggestions and be like, oh, okay, that makes sense. But we were essentially trying to teach people new behavior. Most people don't have assistants. Most people, feel awkward, not anymore with Instacart and all these other things coming up, but would feel awkward having an assistant do their task. And only recently has that become more prevalent. the short of it is obviously that didn't work very well. And we pivoted hard into house cleaning services, which everyone did know how to use.
The funny thing was that we looked at what people were doing, right? Some set of San Francisco elite people, tech people were using it, and had some usage.
There were two markets.
Right. There were two markets that people were using it for. One was house cleaning and the other was groceries.
Well, there was a third. One of them was office managers outsourcing their job.
Yes.
That was a very heavy usage as well. But yes, groceries and then house cleaning services were the other ones.
I remember us debating whether groceries or house cleaning was better to pivot into. And for whatever reason, we decided to pivot into house cleaning, which it turns out is a fucking awful market.
It's a hard market because you're competing with this huge kind of gray area labor pool, which is essentially undocumented workers taking below minimum wage to like clean houses. And we would get comments of people being like, oh, you want $70 to clean our house? I can hire this person for $40 to clean my house, and they're there for 5 hours. And you'd be like, are you even thinking about the math here? Like, you're paying this person less than $10 an hour? Like,
yeah.
I don't know.
It was brutal. But I mean, there were so many lessons from running a services business too, that people like their house cleaned different ways. Some people wanted it to be as cheap as possible. Some people wanted it to be as thorough as possible. And it was really hard to make everyone happy. And the funny thing was, for whatever reason, house cleaning was this super hyped market. After Uber, people were like, what's the next Uber? And so all of this money was being poured into house cleaning. And we had two competitors, HomeJoy and Handy, who raised a ton of money. Well, we were working on the house cleaning for maybe a year. I think it was about a year. And, we had grown it, but it was just the margins were terrible. It was like such a terrible business to run. And we were like, we got to get out of this business.
I remember having that conversation outside of, what was it, DNA Lounge, I think, one day. Hey.
At night?
At night, at like 2 a.m. or something. Where I think we looked at each other and were like, do you really want to be doing this? And we were like, well, no, not really. We should probably talk to Amir about this.
Yeah.
And the next day, we decided to sell.
Yeah, the writing was on the wall. Like our employees, we couldn't retain employees. They didn't want to work on house cleaning. Margins were awful.
Yeah, I mean, in true kind of gig economy margins, we were not counting. Our true margins were very negative.
Deeply negative.
We were doing a significant amount of volume every day across the country. And it was being run pretty efficiently, right? We had a team of, less than 20 people doing this. But at the end of the day, we were competing against other companies that were selling cleanings for $20, and there wasn't really a path to profitability and then also making it a huge company, I think.
Yeah. I think we were doing 200,000 plus a month in sales or something like that.
I think so. Somewhere around there.
Yeah.
Pretty big. But at the same time, 90% of cleanings would be fine. And then you'd have 10% of cleanings just be like horrible. People would complain. People would lose their headphones and then claim cleaners would steal them. We had all sorts of random problems that you then have to deal with, or I had to deal with as kind of the operations person. And yeah, that was horrible.
We decided to sell it. And I remember the process. We were so burned. I mean, I was burned out. I can't speak for you, but I was so burned out from it. I think I was the most emotionally burned out from it because I just felt like I had wrapped my ego up in this being a big company, and I had all this need for the external world to deliver me some massive success. And I was really burned out. And I remember thinking, okay, we're going to sell it. And so we went to these other venture-backed companies like Handy and HomeJoy, and they were in this like deadlock race where they were basically the same size competing for the next round of funding, right? You remember that? Yeah. And I just said, hey, I'm going to sell it to one of you guys by Thanksgiving for whatever you offer me, whatever's the best offer. And that worked. It was the most funny, hilarious, surprising thing.
Yeah.
But that actually worked.
I mean, that's the second time you sold a company in a non-traditional way.
Yeah.
But it worked. Well, the only problem was it didn't actually sell by November, and then you went on vacation.
Well, I'll tell that. Yeah, okay. So I'll cop to that. So I played these two guys off each other. One, Adora was the CEO of Homejoy, and she was the YC. That was the YC one, the other YC company. And then Ocean was the CEO of this company, Handy, and they were on the East Coast in New York. I got offers from both, and actually Adora's offer was much worse, but I actually wanted to sell her because I thought her company was going to be more successful. And so, there's some equity in it, and I was like, hey, can you come up? But they wouldn't move. So we ended up signing a term sheet with Ocean from Handy, who I'm pretty sure, hopefully he hears this podcast too and can text me and confirm, but I'm pretty sure he just wanted to run us out of money.
Oh, I 100% think that was the case.
It took months and months. Like we should have put, there's a lot of lessons in here tactically, but we should have put a shorter expiration term in the contract. But basically we're running out of money, and we had agreed to a 60-day close in the term sheet. And then their lawyer, who was an awful, we just kept bringing up new stuff every day. He'd bring up like a new random issue for this relatively small deal. And then I was so frustrated and burned out. I was basically like, Daniel, you have to deal with this. And I went to Thailand.
Yeah. Well, first off, this deal was small, right? The GM deal that we did with Cruise took us less than 30 days, and it was $1 billion. If anyone tells you can't get it done in 30 days, they're lying, or they're just not competent.
Or they don't care.
Or they don't care. Through that process, new stuff kept coming up. We were slowly running out of money. I remember our lawyer at the end wouldn't close until I sent him a wire. And I was just like, dude, we're going to, it's a whole nother story. There were a lot of other things, but I remember we were waiting on something. And I just remember calling Ocean and saying, look, if we don't close this by Monday, I'm going to fire sale the rest of what's left to Homejoy. And that, I think, is what closed the deal.
It was amazing.
Yeah. And so we closed the deal, and then we both left.
While there was a lot of pain from it, I actually do feel like both of us learned a lot, things that were applicable to later on. Coming out of that, I was like, I just want to not do anything. Eventually, I went to work at YC. What were you thinking coming out of that experience? And we had grinded for 2 years, worked very hard, actually, on making this work, and didn't have much to show for it. Ironically, we actually got a piece, percentage of Handy for all of our investors and a little bit for ourselves. And then, what was it? 5 years later, they sold to Angie's List. And it was like it wasn't a goose egg, actually.
And we actually gave up I remember Homejoy's deal actually gave the founders cash out of the deal. And we declined because they couldn't come up on the equity that would have replaced the shares for our investors. But as part of the Handy deal, I think both Amir and I got $50K, which at the time was, and still is, a significant amount of money, right? We were living off of, I think we were paying ourselves like $36,000 a year in San Francisco. Yeah. And so I got immediately some money. I took a break, relaxed a little bit, but then, I didn't have any savings. So I had to go back, get on to the next thing.
And so tell us about deciding to work with Kyle.
Yeah. I've known Kyle since the
Justin TV intern.
Right? Before, yeah. As a Justin TV intern, driving you guys around to do exciting things. We've always been friends. And I remember being at Baker Beach in the winter, which you can only do in San Francisco when it's like sunny and nice. Sitting out there and Kyle telling me about his new startup idea, which is building self-driving cars and coming out of cleaning services. And I was like, that sounds amazing. There's like 0 people involved in that if we do our job right. And, thinking, hey, that's cool, right? I'd heard about Waymo. Waymo was, I guess it was Google's EV at the time. And they'd been talking about it for a while, but, it wasn't tangible. No one could ride in it at the time. I thought, hey, at the very least, this will be like a fun story. And it gives me something to work on. It's not necessarily my idea, but, I think it'd be a great thing for the world as well. So we chatted a little bit, and he invited me to work with him on that, and I guess the rest is history.
So tell us about what did that look like in the early days? I remember you guys were in YC, and there was a 3-month period of time when Kyle was sprinting to the first version was Audis, right? He had an Audi, and he basically hacked into the controls of the Audi, set up a bunch of cameras on the dash of the car, and then made a very simple program that could detect the median line, right, and would follow along with it. And so could kind of drive the car down the 101 for some unspecified number of seconds. It was kind of like somewhere between 4 seconds and 30 seconds, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And I remember getting in the car and being like, oh my God, this is amazing. This is incredible. And telling him I wanted to invest right then, you know?
Yeah. So the first product we called the RP1, which I can't remember. It's like, I don't remember what it stood for. It stood for something like robotic prototype or robotic
Pilot.
RoboPilot. RoboPilot 1. And that was our first one. And it was this sensor pod that you'd mount on the roof. And it had a couple cameras, so it could do vision and a radar. And then, as you mentioned, it was wired into, we actually installed actuators. And so, the first version we put on his Audi. So Kyle's leased Audi, we cut a hole in the roof. When the lease ended, we just like put a plexiglass sheet over that and sent it back. It would do lane keeping and drive you down the highway. And over the course of a year, we took it from probably what you wrote in the prototype that would drive down the highway for some number of seconds to driving from San Francisco to Palo Alto or back.
I had a friend who was an investor who was talking to Kyle, and he got in the RP1 with Kyle. And I think that, it just had a bad moment or whatever. And what would happen would it be disconnect, right? It would just stop when it couldn't figure out what was going on in the road. And so this time it just like kind of swerved and disconnected after like 2 seconds. And then the guy was just like, what the fuck? And it didn't invest. And that was the story he told me like years later. That's why I didn't invest in Cruise, was that moment.
It was an early prototype and we were doing live demos. So, you don't win them all. At the same time, we got enough funding by doing enough live demos that, we were able to continue working on it for a year. So,
I mean, it was pretty impressive that you were doing live demos on the 101 in traffic, with a thing that had gone, you'd hacked together in a couple months.
Yeah. And back then, we were not nearly as rigorous with our safety, I think, as we are now. But we made sure that we had, tests and everything to make sure that hopefully those occurrences would be rare.
No, I mean, it all worked out in the end. And it was before, for the record, it was before there were any rules on autonomous cars released by California.
That's true. That was just with 4 permits. Actually, I remember when we first came out with it and we released it, the DMV was like, wait, you're going to sell this? And then we actually started conversations with them and, kind of pulled back from that.
So what was it like to be the non-technical co-founder in a self-driving car startup? You are a very nice web developer and designer, but like, what is the, in terms of the self-driving car technology itself, you weren't working on that. So what were you doing in these early days?
Yeah, well, I think nice web developer is still generous. I built the first web page, but it was basically a static page. But, Kyle was in charge of the tech and I was kind of doing basically all the other things, like keeping the company up and running, hiring, recruiting, finances, making sure that we can build stuff as quickly as we could.
How did the next couple of years go? Because you worked on it for about 2 years, right, after YC.
So we started with the RP1, and then about a year after, we actually pivoted the product because we learned that, obviously a highway autopilot system is a nice to have. It's a luxury good, right? People actually believe that they are good drivers. Everyone believes they're above average driver, myself included. And we can't all be above average drivers. And at the same time, they like to think, okay, well, unless I can truly disconnect and not have to drive, if I have to drive at all at any point, then this is not something that I have to have. And I can do it myself and save myself $5,000 or however much these systems now cost. And so we pivoted the company to work on what we always kind of envisioned would be the final product, which is point A to point B driving, which could replace a human driver in a situation. And that's what we're working on today. We're testing in San Francisco and have received some permits to do some truly driverless testing, which, was always kind of a long-term goal.
So has it taken longer than you thought it would? Because I guess that was what we're talking about 5 years ago that you pivoted, right?
Yeah. I mean, it definitely has taken longer than we thought, right? If you had asked us years ago, we would have been saying, oh, we're going to be on the road doing billions of dollars of revenue by this point. But at the same time, as we've been going, what we've found is it is a very, very hard problem. That just makes it more exciting to a certain extent, right? And no one else has solved it either. So for us, seeing the, uncovering that this is a problem that, can have such an enormous impact on the world, but is also very difficult, has just made it like that much more exciting to be working on it.
I think there's a little bit of a lesson in there in that sometimes naivete about a space or ignorance and just coming in with the beginner's mind with the idea that you can do anything is what enables you as an entrepreneur to kind of get the momentum enough that, you aren't discouraged when you find out how hard the problem really is.
Yeah. I mean, I think anything can be broken down into small enough steps so that they seem manageable. People don't remember or forget is you just have to not give up before you get to the end step.
Yeah. That's something I think our mom did really well, just to call back to that, because one of the things that I talk about is that she's a very list-driven person. She would always make lists of everything. All our chores were these lists of things to do. And even to this day, I don't feel super good unless I'm putting things on a list and checking them off. But I think one of the good consequences of that was, well, there are two. One was really the idea that you can break anything down into a list of tasks. And if something on that list is very complicated, you can break that down into its own individual list until the things are approachable and doable. And then the other was the way that she handed out work was she would give us a combined list for all of us, you and me and Damien. And it was like, you guys have to figure out how to distribute and divide these tasks. And you can't play video games until all of these things are done. So it wasn't individual. It was really a group effort. It was kind of this all or nothing vibe, which really taught us a lot about teamwork.
Yeah.
So tell me about selling the company and what that was like.
Oh, man. So we started working on the full kind of self-driving product in, I think, the beginning 2015. At the same time, we raised our Series A. And there was this GM Scout, Avinash, who was kind of in the Bay Area and would check in on kind of tech inside the Bay, automotive tech that GM could potentially use or invest in. And we had met him and basically had invited him every 3 months or so to come check out our progress. And over the course of that year, we went from having basically nothing to having a car that could drive around a loop down in Mission Bay and go through stop signs, stop lights, turn right, left, whatever. And at the beginning of 2016, we kind of said, hey, we hear GM's got this electric car coming, the Chevy Bolt. We'd love to get some of your cars and maybe get an investment from you guys. And so he took that back and he said, okay, we're going to bring out some people and show us what you can do. And so, a few GM people came out. They saw the car. I think I later heard that they rode in our car right after having ridden in another self-driving car company's car. And then they decided to, invest in us, which led to kind of the acquisition.
So I remember you would tell all your prospective employees, this is going to be $1 billion company in 2 years, that year leading up to when you sold the company. Did you know that was going to be the case, or was it just all posturing?
I could see the market for this. I think the speed at which it happened, no one could predict, myself included, and no one could predict, the next 5 years either.
So then GM was like, okay, let's do this. We want to invest. How did that turn into the acquisition?
Well, we went through figuring out how they might invest, but the reality was at the time we were still pre-product, right? We didn't have a fully functioning product yet. We had a very promising prototype, and we were going to continue developing this thing. For GM, they needed assurances that we wouldn't just take their technology, build it, and then go and sell it to their competitors. And at the same time, we were not ready to discuss all the financial terms of licensing it and everything with them at that moment. And so there were a few terms that, we couldn't get past around, how do we have a long-term relationship when it's not clear what, even the economics of this industry will be, long-term. This was back, before Uber went public, before Lyft went public, all those other things. And so the way to solve that was to join forces, right? So that we're all on the same side, working towards our common goal of getting this out as quickly as we can to help with safety and environment and all the other things that self-driving cars bring to the world. And a credit to GM in thinking, hey, these guys can help us do that and pulling the trigger. For us, it's been nothing but, what they had said, right? They put their money where their mouth is. They've continued to fund us, and they've been a great partner for us in building this technology.
How did you decide on what the fair price for it was?
Oh man, I might get in trouble for this story.
We can cut it later if you want.
No, I don't know if it's. I remember getting the first term sheet, and I was sitting in our lunchroom with Kyle because we didn't have enough conference rooms, so we were kind of like huddled in the corner trying to discuss this term sheet with all of these other people around, like working. And we're like, don't let anyone know because we don't want it to be a distraction. So we're like huddled in the corner, and the term sheet says all these things. It's like, they're going to give us a bunch of cars, they're going to give us some money. And at the top, they left the percentage that they would own blank. And it said something like, what was it, $50 million for 5%. Or I said, just write in 5%.
It was $50 million investment, and it said blank percentage.
Yeah, blank percentage. And I'm like, okay, well, we're supposed to redline this. Just put in 5%. And Kyle, I remember he looked at me and he was like, man, that's really high. Do you think they're going to go for that? And I was like, well, we can always back it down later. There's no downside. Let's just see what they say. And so we redlined it and all those things that we talked about of not understanding the financials at the moment and kind of the licensing and IP stuff. We put that all in there and we sent it back. And they came back and they were like, okay, we got to meet. And so they came out and they said, they kind of skipped over the 5% thing. And they went straight to, look, this licensing stuff's not going to work for us because we don't want to just invest in the company and have you guys build something that works and then go off and sell it to everyone else. And we're like SOL, right? So let's talk about an acquisition. What do you want? And I remember sitting there being like, well, what we put on the term sheet. And there was just like silence in the room. And I just kind of sat there and Kyle sat there and we were just like, uh-oh, did we blow it? Well, this is what I was thinking at the time. I'm like, there's no way they go for this. This isn't going to work. And then I remember Dan saying at the time, like, I'm authorized to do anything under $200 million. Anything above that, I have to go to the board. And I responded back, you're going to have to go to your board. And just kind of like left it at that then. And it worked out. So
it's amazing.
You don't get what you don't ask for, I guess is the moral of the story.
You don't get what you don't ask for. I remember you telling me also that during the investment, you were like, oh, we're going to raise this $50 million investment. And I was like, what valuation? And you had said, I want to do it at $1 billion. And I remember thinking that doesn't make any sense. Like that is, why? But actually in retrospect, it has made sense, right? I think one of the things that probably is a lesson to entrepreneurs, which applies to Twitch as well and many other companies like Instagram and YouTube, is what might seem like a lot to you at any given moment and unfathomable and unjustified, the people on the other side are not dumb, right? They're smart investors. They have a lot of industry experience. And oftentimes it turns out that these companies are worth far more after. So, in the intervening 4 years now since you sold the company, you were 40 people when you sold, right? Mm-hmm. Or something. And now 2,000. and you've raised, I think it's been disclosed, right? Several $billion.
Yeah. Yeah. And valued at, 18.
So GM did get a pretty good deal in many ways.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I think if you asked Mary and Dan if they'd do it again, I hope they'd say yes. And at the same time, we asked for it. We knew that it was, something that, well, we thought it was a long shot at the time. And we also knew that it could mess up future deals, right? And that Kyle was right to point out, like, hey, that could tank us in our Series C if, we don't make the progress we need to. But it turns out we didn't need to raise a Series C.
So what was it like when you sold the company? People always want to know this, like, what's it like? It's like a crowning achievement, especially in 2 years. You went from running a cleaning company and begging one of our competitors to buy it for scraps, taking some of those negotiation lessons maybe you learned doing that, to selling $1 billion company, at the forefront of innovation, right? What was the feeling like?
A very foreign experience, because I went from basically someone no one, and I still think this is true, not very many people knew and not many people cared about in an industry that everyone thought Google was dominating, to all of a sudden people were like, oh, okay, you sold your company to General Motors, and, wow, that's impressive, blah, blah, blah. And for me, I hadn't done anything different, right? I'm still the same person, or was, that I was the day before or the day after. And so that was a really weird experience. It wasn't like a slow growing, okay, this is successful, you raise a nice Series C, like everyone goes out and celebrates. It was like literally overnight, okay, now we're part of General Motors, everyone's going to make some money, and I guess it's back to work. So I remember Sam Altman came to our office the day we announced it to celebrate, and he brought a couple bottles of liquor, and he came in the afternoon. By the afternoon, we had already, announced it, had a little champagne with the team, and then everyone was back on their computers working again.
Wow.
And he came in and he was like, what's going on? I thought you guys would be celebrating. And we're like, well, we're going to go to a bar later, but it's the middle of the day. What do you mean? So that was kind of the attitude we took forward, which is, this is great. But at the same time, we signed up to build a self-driving car, and we still have a lot of work to do. So how do we, stay focused on that mission?
How have you stayed focused on that mission? You had an influx of resources. You could hire and expand, and Cruise has done that in a huge way. How have you guys stayed focused as you've kind of built into this kind of non-existent market? I think it's oftentimes really hard for companies to be in the product development phase for so long, right? It's been almost 7 years now. There's a lot of dead bodies of companies that raise a lot of money where they're, building some new technology like a Magic Leap or something like that. Well, they're not dead yet, but, there's a lot of companies that are, you can get trapped in that phase, and it's hard to have that North Star. So how have you stayed focused?
Yeah, I mean, I credit to Kyle and the rest of the leadership team, and Dan as well, making that happen. We have stayed focused by remembering why we're here, right? And I think we say it often, self-driving cars not only are safe for the world, but, to go back to a little what we talked about, can make the world more efficient. And that is what keeps me motivated, right? I want to spend time in my car the way that I want, not having to drive, being able to practice the saxophone if I want to, whatever it is. And I want to give that experience.
Aren't these going to be shared rides, like, where other people get in the car with you? They're not going to appreciate your saxophone playing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, it depends on how many times I get to practice. But, I think the problem with a rideshare today is there's a driver there, right? But I could take a self-driving car myself and practice the saxophone if I wanted to. But yes, in a shared setting, I would say, let's limit the smelly foods and the noise, because you got to be a good rider as well. But, I think for us, it's always been, look, we set out to do this. Success is not measured by the money that you get or the publicity that you get or even the people you hire. Those are a means to getting to our final goal. which is delivering a self-driving car that can change the world. And I think that making sure that every person that comes in understands that, and yes, we'll get paid along the way and we'll have fun along the way and we'll meet great people along the way. That has always been part of what we've been doing, but really staying focused on kind of the end goal. We reiterate it often.
So when's that going to come? Are we talking 2021 or 2029?
I think it will be sooner than people expect. I'm not going to give you a date, but we did get a permit to start testing truly driverless vehicles in California. That's a big step for us. To not have a backup driver in the car, shows some serious improvement and progress on the safety capabilities of the car. And so I think it will be sooner than people think.
And so what was your internal journey like in the company? You went from, once again, kind of like user voice, the non-technical co-founder was doing everything, all the recruiting and making a website and managing the office team and everything else, right? Negotiating deals, to now 7 years later, what's that like?
Yeah. So over time, I have given up basically each of those functions, recruiting, finance, comms, marketing, to people who are much better suited and more skilled at those things. And over time, actually, all of those people, you hire a leader, they all want to report to the CEO, not the COO. And so I had to do a lot of introspection around that, because I was going from having a huge scope and delivering a lot of projects to reduce scope, but more focus, and really trying to make sure that I was still impactful at the company. And so where we landed and what I'm working on now is a consumer-facing product. I bring kind of the startup mentality of like, what do people actually want in this first experience? And also the culture aspects of growing. We grew from 40 people to 2,000 in less than 5 years or so. That is not without its pains. Bringing so many people with different backgrounds together so quickly means you've got to continue to restate why we're here and what we're doing and what the norms are and how we work together. And so I've had to embrace, over the last few years, like a different role and a different type of leadership, not just can I close a deal on a building and make sure that we deliver the building on time with all the right power in the right places, to, how do we better work together as a leadership team to make sure the messages that people have are the right ones and that we're working well together. Because at the end of the day, you spend more waking hours with your colleagues than you probably do with anyone else. And so if you don't enjoy it, people in Silicon Valley, they have options. So you've got to create that culture that people want to be a part of.
I think that's amazing. And you tapped onto something that I think is very common in Silicon Valley, but often very hard for founders, which is graduating from doing everything and being responsible for everything to having to give up those things slowly to people who are experts as the company grows. And oftentimes people have a lot of struggle with that, right? Because it almost feels like you're being reduced in scope. I mean, maybe you are actually being reduced in scope in some ways. How did you get right with that?
I mean, I think it's still something I think about today, right? To say that I'm completely over it, I think would be wrong. At the same time, I think about two things. One is what's best for the mission and Cruise. And then two, I've stopped, and this has been harder because I think Cruise actually values a lot of output, right? One of the things we care a lot about, and now we've been able to do so much, is we measure scope and impact of teams and people and everything. And I've had to rethink how that is measured, or how I measure it, and how, what is important to Cruise, and not just as what is the kind of very tangible thing you have done, but how other people, perceive you, how other people like working with you, how you've been able to influence them or help them grow. And I think that that's an undervalued thing, especially at a small company where, you've got 40 people in a room, you can talk to them all and make sure that everyone's on the same page. So it's a little of shifting both what's valued, both by myself and the company over time.
Yeah, at high output management, Andy Grove writes that a manager's output is equal to his team's output, but also all of the output of all the teams that he influences. And so maybe it's a little bit of shifting from, that former part of the equation to the latter part.
Yeah, definitely. And that's a hard thing to internalize and to, make sure that you see that value. But I think, the leaders of really large companies have to, because you can't actually do the work yourself.
Yeah. You run a company, with Kyle, who's one of our original Justin TV co-founders, and Dan, who's the CEO now of Cruise. You guys run a company that's pretty big, right? It's almost 2,000 people.
Yeah.
And so how do you decide when do you want to trade off how you show up at work? Are you telling people to do stuff that way that mom, kind of told us it's my way or the highway, or are you taking a different approach, or is there a different time for each?
I think there's a time and place for each, right? I think what I now go to is what am I trying to get accomplished, right? What is my actual intention, right? In some cases, I could be raging and be like, I really just want to like yell at this person or tell them like, hey, you've got to do it this way. But the reality is like that might not be what I actually want or what's actually best for the situation. And I think I have to step back and think about, what do I really want and what is the best way to get that, right? And how can I influence that? Because I can't control people. I can only help them and guide them and give them context for what we're trying to do. And so I think every situation is different, right? I might be in a situation where someone needs direct feedback and I'll have to say, hey, this is what I'm seeing. This is what's happening. And, we're going to work on this together to figure out the best way forward. And other times I might need to, take a breath and think through it and come up with a new plan.
How did you learn that restraint? Because I definitely feel like it didn't exist in our household growing up. Like if mom felt something should be a certain way, this is the way it's going to be.
Yeah, well, I think I've just learned this over the last couple of years as well, that there's a choice that can be made and what role do we play in that choice. And actually, my leadership coach, also your leadership coach, Carol Robin, helped me understand that, right? That every situation, there's a choice and you have a role in that. You don't necessarily have to react in that way, right? Or you can step back and say, how is my reaction or what I'm feeling serving me right now in this moment?
I love that. Did you feel like that was easy to adopt? Because sometimes you're getting swept along and you don't even realize it, right? So how do you remind yourself to think that?
Yeah. I'd say first off, it's not easy, not at all, right? Everyone's natural reaction is to be thinking about what to say next. And I think it starts with taking a deep breath and kind of stepping back and saying, okay, instead of trying to respond to what you're saying, let me try and think about what you are actually saying and trying to understand that and think about what is the best path forward for both of us, right? And in a lot of cases, that might be waiting until you are a little more calm or you've thought through, okay, this is what I'm going to say and this is how it's going to come off, or being able to state your intention on what you want to get out of this. I think that that's something that I have only realized, in the last couple of years, and has changed the way I view leadership.
Yeah, a big breakthrough from what Carol taught me, and she teaches in her course, is really taking a second to feel your emotional state and to be cognizant of your emotional state. And so in the past, I would maybe get angry, something wasn't going well in a meeting or at the company or whatever, and I'd get angry and I would be swept along. I'd think this isn't going well. It's this team's fault or whatever. And I'd be like, I shouldn't shout, but I'll really dig in here. And I'd often say stuff that made it very obvious that I was upset, but I felt like I'm just doing my job. And after working with Carol, I realized, anger in that situation is a signal. It's not bad and it's not good. It's neutral and it's just a signal. And maybe that anger at that moment is just saying, hey, you think something's wrong. You feel threatened. or I feel threatened, right? And I feel threatened because I'm worried that if this project doesn't go well, the company's not going to succeed. And then my identity in public will be ruined, right? And so I feel threatened. And now how do I want to proceed with this information and being able to use that as a constructive way, as a topic of conversation, but not to be compelled to be, yelling at people or to do any certain maybe negative or destructive course of action. And I remember the first time that I ever manifested that at work in a meeting, and the meeting was not going well. And we'd been repeating the same meeting for months and months, and there's never any progress. And I was feeling super frustrated. And I was thinking to myself, man, I'm feeling like really tense. My jaw is tightening up. My chest is tightening up. And I just stopped the meeting. I said, I'm feeling angry right now. And then everybody was like, oh my God, the CEO's feeling angry. People looked terrified. And I said, it's not you guys. You have been executing what we agreed to months ago. And you've been reporting the things that we agreed to report. I think what's making me angry or frustrated is really that I feel like we're spinning in circles and we haven't reevaluated what the goals of this team are. And so that led us to a constructive place where we all agreed that they would go and redefine the goals and come back, the next week. And so in the past, I would have just pushed that anger down and been like, oh, you're not supposed to be angry at work, but I would have been frustrated. I maybe would have bled out and I would have, kind of been obviously like upset and kind of like a little pissy seeming. But I also maybe would have ignored it and just, blew off steam later, but not actually listened to what the signal was telling me. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that was a big, important breakthrough for me, was to really understand how emotions play out in my interpersonal relationships, and that they were data and I could just listen to them and not necessarily be compelled by, swept along by them.
Yeah. In the same place, I think taking a step back, right, for me, and saying like, okay, what am I actually trying to get out of this? Or what is the most efficient path to get what I want? Or should this affect me as much as it does, has been, a life-changing skill.
Yeah. Brother, thanks for joining me on the podcast. I think people will enjoy this one.
Yeah, I hope so.
If not, they got what they paid for.
That's fair.
All right, that was my conversation with Dan. I hope you guys liked it. If you enjoyed the podcast, bang out that 5-star rating on iTunes. And if you want to get in touch, give me feedback, you can hit me on Twitter @JustinCahn. I always love hearing from you. All right, see you next week. Bye.